Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of videos where we look at the state in international relations. This video looks at the pre-modern feudal state in Western Europe. Now, as we've said before, international relations usually assumes the existence of the state and operates on the assumption that the state is the primary or the most important actor in global politics. But it's important to remember that there was nothing preordained about the Westphalian state that emerged. Indeed, it's an interesting thought experiment to think about what the world might have looked like had a different model of state formation, say the Chinese state or the Mongolian state or a Native American state, become the globally dominant model. But that said, it was the Westphalian state model that became the dominant state in the world today. And so in this video, we're going to consider where that model came from and how it developed as it did. As our starting point, let's remember that the Roman Empire dominated Europe and the Mediterranean from about 27 BCE to about 476, though the eastern portion of the empire did not formally fall until the mid-1400s. At its peak, some 20% of the world's population lived under the rule of the empire, which stretched from the Atlantic coast of Europe around the entirety of the Mediterranean to modern-day Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and back across North Africa. Under the empire, tax systems helped maintain a large standing army. Wealthy patrons could support the arts, and citizens who were relatively small in number enjoyed legal protections and could, at least during the Republican era, even participate in governance. The Roman Empire constructed roads and water systems, maintained vast trade networks, and constructed monuments, many of which remain even today. But over time, the Roman Empire became increasingly stagnant politically and economically. Corruption was widespread and inequality was high. In the 5th century, soldiers from groups in what is today Germany, called barbarians by the Romans, invaded the Roman Empire and laid siege to Rome. The emperor was deposed and the empire broke into small fiefdoms. In the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe, at least in the West, was left without a central political organization. The legal institutions, laws, and so on that had governed the continent for nearly 500 years fell apart. The standard laws, rules, military, bureaucracy, systems of taxation, all features that defined the empire, were replaced by local networks that connected peasant and lord. Power was rooted primarily on local lords, not distant figures. Perhaps nowhere is this fragmentation clearer than in the Holy Roman Empire. Comprised of about 1,800 distinct political units, each of which claimed a degree of independence, the Holy Roman Empire occupied much of present-day Germany for nearly 1,000 years, from about 800 to 1806. What's more, the boundaries between these areas was not defined in reality as well as a line could be drawn on a map. The ability of a lord to project force declined the further one moved away from the centers of power, like forts or castles, and as a result, boundaries were far more fuzzy than the clear lines projected here. The system that eventually emerged is today understood as feudalism. We normally think of feudalism as the system of power in the Middle Ages, where kings granted power to greater lords like princes and dukes, who in turn ruled over the lesser lords, the earls, the viscounts, the barons, and so on, each of whom maintained a group of knights who ruled over peasants and townspeople. But the relationship between the higher and lower levels of this pyramid was more complex than this simple model presents. Under the feudal system, local nobles controlled land ostensibly granted to them by the more distant kings. In exchange, they were expected to provide troops in support of the kingdom. The peasants who lived on the land were obligated to provide the lord with a portion of their produce, ostensibly in exchange for protection. The system, in other words, was not simply a system of top-down rule. Instead, each layer of the pyramid exercised power over the lower layers, but in turn was also dependent on them. There are a few important things to remember about this arrangement. First, under the feudal system, political and economic power were fused. The lord only had access to wealth insofar as he had access to control over land, and land was granted by nobles higher up in the food chain in exchange for loyalty and service. Thus, private property as we think of it today, and wealth in land and money, were politically, not economically defined. And when service was no longer desired, the lesser nobles could, in theory at least, simply be replaced by the king. Political authority was also decentralized and conditioned on individual relationships, a chain of parcelized sovereignties. There was no state in the sense of an independent institution outside the individual actors who comprised it. As Louis XIV, the King of France from 1643 to 1715 famously decried, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state." Vassalage, the system under which lesser nobles were granted control over land and other privileges in exchange for military support for the higher nobles, was both the basis of wealth and power. And while the word of the lords was absolute, it was the relationship between the lords on which property was dependent. At the same time, standing military forces belonging to the state did not necessarily exist. Instead, each lord maintained their own household guard of greater and lesser sizes. These soldiers, usually knights and their retainers, were expected to serve when called upon by higher nobles, and each had to field their own equipment. Many were highly skilled, but they were often difficult to control. Peasants could be levied into service, but they were not well trained and their service was generally limited. The best militaries relied not on drafted peasants, but on professional mercenaries. Production during the Middle Ages was primarily rooted in the manorial system. Under the manorial system, production was largely undertaken by peasant farmers. Lords granted them access to land, in exchange for which they were expected to provide a certain portion of their production to the lord. The lord may provide access to some technologies or services, a mill to grind grain into flour, or a press to make oil, in exchange for more produce. But it was largely a cashless society. Appropriation of surplus, the lord taking a portion of production, was based on the threat of expulsion, not on rent per se. Indeed, there were often real limits placed on the ability of the lord to extract more from the peasants. Customary limits prevented lords from raising rents too quickly. Social obligations also required the lord to provide certain benefits. A peasant who fell ill, broke a leg, or grew old could not simply be expelled from the land, but had to be supported by the lord. Peasants also enjoyed far more time off and more holidays than we do today, perhaps working a total of 150 days a year. One of the other things to keep in mind about the feudal system was that the system of feudalism we normally think of today extended only to the secular realm. Kings and lords had only secular authority. A parallel system, centered on the Roman Catholic Church, maintained a similar degree of authority over the spiritual realm, exercising religious authority over the population. In theory, the two systems were entirely separate. While secular lords could make decisions over their territory and the people who resided there, they could not make religious decisions. And conversely, religious leaders were supposed to refrain from secular affairs. In spite of this, of course, the line between the two was often blurred, and tensions between the two grew quickly. Knights fought in wars called by the Church. Lords claimed divine right as the reason for their rule. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the only central political authority was the Roman Catholic Church. That institutional power was now being challenged by secular political leaders who wanted authority over all aspects of life and the ability to rule without consulting the Church, leading to conflicts between the two. In the Holy Roman Empire, debates over the lines of succession and the process of appointing new lords saw the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, seeking to exercise control over the emperor. In England, the Magna Carta laid the foundation for the separation of church and state. Largely an attempt by lesser nobles to prevent the king from aligning with the church and seizing their property, the Magna Carta was rejected by the church. In France, conflict between the church and the nobility resulted in the Pope excommunicating King Philip in 1303. The king responded by arresting the Pope, freeing him 4 days later, but nevertheless attempting to assert supremacy of the king. Even beyond the inevitable conflicts between church and state, the feudal system imposed real limits on the process of state building. Agricultural productivity was limited, and there was little incentive to innovate production. Transportation was slow and expensive. With the exception of small, lightweight, and expensive items like spices, there was little room for trade. Where markets did exist, they were profitable only on a small scale. Trade in grain, for example, was limited to a radius of about 20 miles. Competition between nobility, clergy, and peasants limited the formation of political units and resulted in the lack of a common identity. Nations, as we think of them today, had not yet generally emerged. Sovereignty, as we think of it today, was limited and divided among multiple power centers, often laying overlapping claims to the same territory, and was dependent on political concessions from those higher up in the food chain. Central authority was weak, and the king was dependent on the willingness of lesser nobles to go along with their desires. And the small economy, lack of tax revenue, and limited coinage made maintaining permanent militaries difficult. Instead, mercenaries would be hired for specific campaigns and dismissed when no longer needed. So that concludes our very brief overview of the feudal state in Western Europe. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please leave them below, and please be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Thanks, everyone. Bye.